Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to this final day of the CERC 2021 conference. I'm delighted to welcome you this morning to a special panel on COVID politics and care ethics research. So we will have 4 speakers today. We will take them one at a time. And as with the usual, as is the usual process with the webinars, please type your questions into the Q&A box. Once all of the speakers have given their presentations, I will moderate the Q&A, choosing questions for the speakers to respond to. So we will take our speakers in the order that they are placed in the program. So that means that our first speaker will be Joan Tronto, who will be speaking on Beyond Wealth Care, Caring Democratically as the Path to a Multiracial, Non-Imperial Caring. Joan, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you, Fiona. Thanks to the organizers, to the remarkable job that they have done, and to the tech people as well. Thank you, Michael. I want to acknowledge that I'm living on the unceded territory of the Lenape people, whose word for island actually gives name to Manhattan. I'm going to share my screen with you all, and here are the slides. Is it possible to care justly in an unjust society? We currently live in a world in which care is lavished upon the wealthy, and the care of the people and planet is given short shrift. Is this unjust? Yes. Can we change it? Perhaps. Here I want to call out wealth care in order to try once again to make a persuasive case that the world can be differently organized if we focus democratically on care. In my short remarks, I obviously won't be able to do more than gesture towards the full argument in this paper. I want to emphasize that wealth care perverts care. To care well under a system of wealth care is to care unjustly. And it's my hope that making the argument this way will persuade people to think more seriously about the fact that what they're doing is fundamentally unjust. Wealth care is a neologism, forgive me. It is inspired by Harry Frankfurt's important essay, The Importance of What We Care About, from 1988, in which he makes that argument. The title kind of gives away the argument of the paper. Wealth care is a set of values that posit that the growth of wealth is the central value, activity, and purpose of society, and that society's rewards should go to those who create and grow wealth. Now, it's not exactly the same as neoliberalism, not exactly the same as capitalism, although those languages are capturing much of what I'm talking about. But I think this language is more direct and more precisely aimed at the people who are, if you will, doing something about wealth that we want to undo. Wealth care functions for the wealthy. It depends upon passing, the whole purpose of wealth care is to pass wealth on to one's heirs, which makes it familistic, patriarchal, racialist, all of that in a very deep manner. It focuses on the state by creating the conditions for maximizing wealth. This is both when the state is a source of wealth itself, for example, in the military-industrial complex, even in the exploitation of poor people in the criminal justice system, in the marketizing of nursing homes. In all these ways, the state is taken to be a protector of and a source of wealth. And it mythologizes the freedom as a free market. Let us remember Karl Polanyi's argument in The Great Transformation that a self-regulating market is a utopian experiment. So wealth care pulls the entire economy in its direction. Back in 2010, Jeffrey Winters in his book Oligarchy described what he called the income defense industry. Not only do the wealthy control wealth, but they also control most of the people who are doing extraordinary other work in the society. Um, People become accountants rather than musicians because that's where the money is. And what's the opportunity cost of the growth of the financial sector? Now, existing critiques of neoliberalism are all applicable here, right? About the importance of speed up, precarity, taking advantage of people, all of that works. But welfare does more than create economic inequality. It also benefits a small number of people, and their primary interest is to make sure that others' needs and interests are not fully expressed and represented. It's part of their interest to make sure that societies are not more democratic. Furthermore, wealth care affects people's sense of responsibility. Insofar as economic achievement becomes the measure of everything, people come to think of themselves only as producers and workers and consumers, and lose their capacity to think of themselves as citizens who may have larger responsibilities. Nancy McLean begins her book by quoting an historian of the public choice economics movement. The public choice revolution rings the death knell of the political we. Now, Polanyi actually foresaw this as well, um, but we will go on. Wealth care also benefits from pervasive racist inequalities. The racial wealth gap in the United States is huge. For every dollar a typical white household has, a black one has 12 cents. Latinos have 21 cents. People with wealth attribute their success to their own individual actions, not to historical advantage, but blame the people who but by the same token, blame people who are poor for being poor, not for the fact that they have been historically disadvantaged. And the wealthy have no interest in disrupting, or even for that matter, looking closely at this pattern. We could talk for a long time about the ways in which wealth care distorts and damages care. And you all already know this, that care as a market system is exploitative, that care is very expensive, and so employment in the care sector is almost always exploitatively organized. And what is marketized is care for the wealthy. Their desires outweigh others' needs. And what's left over of care that can't be marketized becomes an externality. It gets stuffed back into the private family or other places that are not seen from the market. Family structure, by the way, is changing under the conditions on non-wealth and precarity. In the United States, marriage is now only for the well-to-do. And sociologists have begun to use this language of thinking of children as an investment. When I made this point not too long ago, Nancy Fulbury sent me a picture of an investment bank's ad that said, think of your investment as your children. So all of this distorts and damages care. So wealth care creates this condition where the best forms of care are forms of unjust care. Think about it. Imagine you're raising your children and you're wealthy. What do you tell your children about the poor children in the world? You have to tell them something. And what you tell them is, there's something wrong with their parents, or they just didn't make good choices. But on one level, you're lying. In an article that was published last year, Matthew Stewart wrote about the near wealthy and called the 9.9% the new American aristocracy. Those folks too have to benefit from and be especially interested in having schools that are in their neighborhood that are good, which gives them an advantage over other children as they compete for those limited places in the good colleges. If you're middle class, you too are in this situation where you're competing to keep yourself there against the people you think are somehow trying to take away your resources. And it creates tremendous resentment against the poor. But if you're poor or racialized or marginalized, then you have nothing to contribute to the society, according to the wealthy, because if you had something to contribute, you would already be wealthy. So the point I want to make here is that caring well for one's own in an unequal wealth care society requires that you make judgments that are competitive, that are driven by desire for your own children's success, your own success, which requires and encourages you to treat others unjustly. I don't think we often put it that way, but it's a really important thing to notice. We are basically creating a society where the goal is to create others unjustly. Now, under COVID, this has become much worse. Oops. Under COVID, this has become much worse. We already know this, but let me just remind you of some of this. Essential workers and healthcare workers bear the most risk and often get the lowest pay. As they are cared for, they're often not, as they do the care, they're often not cared for. And I just cite a couple of articles here, but there are millions of them. What makes it even more insulting in a way, and the CARE manifesto talks about this, is the care washing that's going on. That is, companies using the rhetoric of care, there's a picture of some people from Amazon there, to make themselves look better in the crisis when they're hurting their workers as much as anyone else. This is a poster from the UK. May they never be deemed low-skilled again. Because who are these essential workers? You could have asked any of us, and we could have told you exactly who they'd be a year ago. The healthcare workers, including everyone involved in hospitals and care facilities, including the people working in funeral homes, the people doing the laundry at the hospitals, the home health aides, the providers of food and essential services. These are the people who are really the essential workers, but we also know they're the ones who are suffering the most. The realities of what's happening in the pandemic are quite dire. For women, more women have left the labor market. In the United States, people are saying a decade of progress has been lost. Moving work home meant women had much more domestic labor to perform, and levels of domestic violence have increased. And for all poor workers, women and men alike, they have been forced out of the workforce more quickly. There's an article today in the New York Times that talks about this on a global level and says more egalitarian countries did better, more unequal countries did worse. But in general, if you were poor, you got pushed out of the labor market. There also, the recovery is slower, and people are living really in extraordinary precarity, both in terms of food and in terms of everything else. We already knew that care work is poorly organized and poorly paid. And the working conditions of precarious care workers made the pandemic worse. For example, in nursing homes in Canada, in the United States, where the workers are paid so poorly that they work in several homes over the course of a week, they're the ones who were kind of vectors of disease going from one place to another. Nancy Fulbright noticed that there was this very interesting moment where hazard pay came into existence, but it didn't last. And as it went away, it became a problem for people who are really putting their lives at risk every day. So the brunt of the suffering, exposure to the disease, is borne by the care workers and the poorly paid essential workers. And as to the wealthy have grown so much wealthier in the past year. The McCarthy pieces in Forbes magazine, the Institute for Policy Studies there, the wealth of US billionaires grew $931 billion, 32% in the first 7 months of the pandemic. Now, contrast that growth of wealth with the conditions of PPE, where nurses were putting plastic bags on their bodies in order to go into treat COVID patients. It's not peer-reviewed, but this Dr. Prasad has made the argument that really, in medical care, there is money to be made from very high-tech medical interventions, inventing a new screen to put into somebody's heart, but not any money to be made from getting an extra nurse on the shift or making sure there's enough PPE. And as a result, there is always a wealth gap that moves in the direction of higher level care when simple things like a tank of oxygen could help people live. The ventilator situation in the United States early on was talked about a lot. Why aren't there more ventilators? And some reporters from the New York Times went back and looked. The United States government had hired a firm to develop a low-cost inexpensive, easy to organize, easy to operate ventilator. What happened to it? That company was bought out by one of the larger ventilator manufacturers, and the project was killed. It would have cut into their profits, and they decided to kill the project instead. These are just little examples, but this happens all the time. Think for a moment about what's happening now that we have vaccines. The vaccines are disproportionately available in higher income countries. In some poor countries in the world, there's no vaccine at all. There was a nice piece in the British Medical Journal, not my usual source, that made this point. The burden of COVID-19 follows extraction patterns dating from colonial times, with the worst outcomes suffered by marginalized people and poorer countries. The COVID-19 political economy is extractive, repressive, and competitive. Now, some people are optimistic that things will get better. And there is some evidence that these concerns are being addressed, but they're often in familiar forms that still disregard care. So COVAX and WHO project to share the vaccines. But here, let us remember John Stuart Mill. The great error of reformers and philanthropists was, quote, to nibble at the consequences of unjust power instead of redressing the injustice in itself, unquote. Yeah, after we get all the vaccine, we'll give what's left over to you people is a way to nibble at the consequences of unjust power. That's what is happening still with wealth care. But let me say at the end that there is a reason to be optimistic. As Piven and Cloward argued in Poor People's Movements, when somehow the system seems to crack open, people begin to question whether or not things are properly organized. And I think we are at such a moment. Diva Woodley, in her remarkable work on Black Lives Matter as a care movement, argues that the Black Lives Movement will be able to sustain itself because it takes care seriously. That's a really important prospect. Care proposals are proliferating, and even before the pandemic, there were all these proposals and papers written about the need for more care in the world. And since the pandemic, more of these ideas have occurred. Pat Armstrong, by the way, is circulating one for you Canadians called the Care Economy. And furthermore, the New York Times has printed the words, the care economy, multiple times on the op-ed page in the last month. So caring democracy, of course, begins with recognizing care responsibilities. Naming wealth care as a system of avoiding responsibilities helps us to see how responsibilities might be differently organized. So perhaps we can seize this moment of cracks in the system to open up these issues of responsibility for care by gender, race, indigeneity, who is really essential. And importantly, it might be possible to shift what we care about, care, not wealth. Thank you. I have a lot of, I'll put the references on the chat.
I think if other people are like me, we've all been madly scrambling down notes and references as you've been talking. So that would be great if we could see those. Thank you so much, Joan. Those are very, very important remarks and things that no doubt we've all been thinking about, but you put it so eloquently. So, so thank you very much for that. Right, we move on now to our next speaker. I'm happy to introduce Carlo Leget from the University of Humanistic Studies in Utrecht. And he will be speaking to us about a care ethical analysis of COVID-19 policymaking, how to set up research with societal impact. Carlo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fiona. I will begin by sharing my slides immediately. And there we are. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the space in the program to tell something about a research project that we are still in the midst of, which started last year. And I think it's very topical. And I would like to tell something about it, but also to invite you to think with me and maybe even to advise me or to help us as a group in this project that we think, we hope might make some difference in the society in the Netherlands. And I think it is exactly what Joan just told us. The injustice is great, but how to change it? And this is one of the goals of this project. First of all, every research is contextual. And I think if you look at the Netherlands, we are a very privileged country. We are small, we are rich, we are densely populated. There's a wonderful infrastructure. We have a democratic society, autonomy, equality, transparency are all very important. But we cannot compare what COVID did to the Netherlands, cannot be compared to what it did to Italy, to Brazil, to the United States, to India. I think we are also very privileged in the sense of the damage that was done to our country. So this is one of the reasons that I want to show this slide to be aware of the big differences worldwide between the pandemic. And the second thing is that we are trying to make an analysis of policymaking, and policymaking is something that is a very cultural thing, in the sense that the cultural values that are dominant in the Netherlands, like equality and transparency, and this non-hierarchical culture that we have, are a very important context for the way Dutch people make policy and try to bring policy into action. So that was the second reason I wanted to show this slide. Now, if we look at the news last week, even although we are a very rich country and a very well organized, I think, if you look at neighborhoods who struggle with poverty, we see that showing up at vaccination programs is low, it's 30 to 40%, and the chance of transmission is twice as big. The chance of dying of COVID is twice as big. And in these neighborhoods, there is not much confidence in the government and lots of misinformation. Of course, as we all know, underlying morbidities. And a lot of people in these neighborhoods do not even receive or understand the information from the government. So there is a huge gap, not only between rich and poor, but also in terms of how to reach a large part of our population, of our citizens. So that is one of the reasons why we thought we have to do something about it. And quoting my very the last sentence of Carrying Democracy, it is time that we begin to change our political and social institutions to reflect that care is a central concern of human life. I think in our department, we're always trying to combine research with change, with activism. And this is something in development. We're not perfect there, but I think it is very deep motivation of many of my colleagues and myself. And in May last year, as we were in the first COVID wave, there was a rumor that the Dutch government would have a research call about COVID research. And at the 25th of June, there was a research call on societal dynamics. And we thought, this is our opportunity, this is our chance. It was a high pressure cooker thing, because we had a deadline of 3 weeks to make the proposal, and we had to start before September 15 that year. So it was a lot of work in a short time, and we did make a proposal, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we wanted to do. And if we look at the situation in the first wave in the Netherlands, it is interesting to see that the government showed strong leadership right from the start. If you compare it with for instance, United States, Brazil, or Hungary, it's a huge difference. Right from the start, the government was very clear about what is the policy of fighting COVID and what are the two central aims. Well, the policy is limiting infection and mortality among vulnerable groups. And interestingly, no one asked who is labeled as vulnerable and who has the power of definition there. Yeah. And the second one, preventing a collapse of the healthcare system. If you compare, for instance, the Netherlands with Germany, then the ICU capacity in the Netherlands it's very limited. Germany has 5 times our capacity. And nobody asked what implicit hierarchy is behind this choice. And we had a management team, COVID management team, and the people who are in charge there in the team were, you know, the epidemiologists and the hardcore physicians, and there was no whatsoever idea about COVID being something that maybe is also a social and a justice problem. Going back to culture, this is our Prime Minister, Mark Rutte. He's a neoliberal, for 10 years now in charge, political survivor. And he is a kind of a neoliberal manager of the country. So what he says is, take your responsibility as citizens, we will take care of you. And then this policy is kind of seen as the only good way of doing or answering to the problems that we are in with COVID. Now, in order to set up a research design in such a situation, we thought there are 3 major challenges. And I think maybe it's very familiar in your country, but in the Netherlands, it is not easy to get money for care ethical research because care ethics is seen as one-sided and biased. It is feminist, it is about care, it is not objective like medical ethics or bioethics. Well, it's of course lots of nonsense there, but it's not easy to change the image that a word like care, and I think even the word zorg in the Netherlands, as we pronounce it, is even different as the word care in English. So there are many problems with the image of care ethics there. And the second one, how to choose and give voice to vulnerable groups, because there are many, many vulnerable groups and they are hard to reach because there are so many restrictions. And then the third great challenge, how to have societal impact. We want to change the world and not end up in a drawer. So these were the 3 central challenges. And if you look at the ethical justification of the restriction policy of the first wave in our political system, 3 things I think were very striking for the first wave. The first thing is that central concepts like common good, equality, vulnerability were used without being conscious of the moral content. And different ethical theories, a little bit of deontology, a little bit of Aristotelian teleology, were used for fragmentary justifications. It is a kind of cut and paste way of selling your message. A second thing that was very strongly felt in the first wave was the concept of care that was used in a new way. No longer just for the healthcare sector, but also as something important for building a coherent society. In the first wave, we had people applauding for healthcare workers, but we had also this appeal for helping your neighbor, or being at the same time keeping distance, but at the other time connecting and doing grocery or other small things, caring things just to keep up society. And then a third striking thing, I think, is that although in Dutch society, autonomy and democracy are high values and central values, many decisions about the needs of vulnerable groups were taken without hearing these groups. They were just they were not there and not consulted. So there were interesting challenges, and we defined 2 major research goals. The first is to make a comprehensive ethical analysis of these policy choices that were made. And Adrienne will talk about that later and give you some more insight in that. And the second major goal is developing a care ethical framework for policy making, supported by relevant stakeholders like these vulnerable groups, for a next pandemic, but also for a caring society that is sufficiently resilient to deal with future crises. Well, this is very much, and these are high aims, big research goals for a 2-year project, but we are ambitious. So we thought, let's just do it. And how did we then respond to these 3 challenges that I formulated? Well, how to get money for care ethical research, and how to change or convince, that's a better word, how to convince the panel that judged about the money that we were the best candidates. I think we did it by arguing that care ethics is qualified to do a complex job like this precisely because it is a kind of thinking that considers ethical theories as answers to historical changes. So care ethics is flexible. It is very much aware of context of diversity and particularity. But also because care ethics is the kind of ethics that takes serious the experiential knowledge of all stakeholders, also of vulnerable people. And it is also a kind of ethics that takes seriously vulnerable people by making their voice heard and by making them for their own decision responsible. And then, of course, it emphasizes this intrinsic connection between the personal and the political, which is forgotten in the neoliberal way of that the Netherlands is managed. And then finally, it works with critical insights that can illuminate the ethical dimension of policy choices that are kind of hidden at the moment. The second challenge, how to choose and give voice to vulnerable groups. Well, on the one hand, we were very pragmatic there because we knew that we had little time to not only to engage stakeholders, but also to set up research and carry out research. So we choose vulnerable groups that we are already connected with, more or less, some more or less, and we try to make a good argument for them. And then we distinguish between groups that have much or little media attention and groups that have much or little influence on policy. And there you see the grids. And I think it's interesting and maybe also something that is recognizable from other forums at this conference. The refugees and the migrants are in the first wave did have no media attention and no influence at all. And we all know that there's a lot going on in these with these people, and this is the reason why we thought it is extremely important. Although the older people living in healthcare facilities were much on the national television, had influence, and still a lot was going wrong there. So we tried to make a kind of a first design there. And then the challenges for our research design: how to have societal impact, how to not end up in a drawer. Well, by involving the stakeholders from the start and designing feedback loops, involving policymakers on different levels, also the branch organizations of the different vulnerable groups, roundtables with colleagues from different bioethics departments, members of this consortium, policymakers of the Ministry of Health, Welfare and Sport. So we try to make it a kind of a common movement, and not just a project of our small university, but something that is already trying to change mindsets and change the world as we are doing research. It's a kind of participatory action research design, you could say. Well, with that in mind, we ended up with combining different methods and have 5 work packages. The discourse analysis that Adrienne will talk about in a minute. Understanding the lived experiences of the 4 groups that are labeled as vulnerable. And these groups, we are already in contact with these groups, and the first interviews are starting now in these months. But also the third phase, interestingly, investigating alternative solutions. So the experiential knowledge and the creativity of these groups is very important to listen to, because they can also help us to find contextual particular solutions that are relevant for these people. Then a kind of a check phase of 3 months where we confront our experiences and solutions into other societal sectors that are heavily under pressure, and culture sector and education sector. And then developing, and this is the big aim and the big question, developing a care ethical policy framework for caring and for a sustainable society. Now, this is the grid that shows how we are trying to work, and it is a mixed. You see, it is partially discourse analysis, partially empirical research, partially philosophical analysis and writing. And we do this with we have a core team of 6 people Adrienne and Pieter are most of the time working on it, but we also are working with other colleagues who are ambassadors for groups, and we have the great advantage of working with former policy advisor of the Ministry of Health, who is a very, I think, a valuable guide in understanding the way of thinking of the government. First findings. Well, there are a number of inconsistencies and problems, and Adrienne will tell you about this, but also the landscape is constantly changing. And this is hard in this kind of research because new insights are being developed all the time, and we learn quickly. So the isolation of all the citizens in the first wave was not repeated in the second wave because everyone saw that it was not a good idea. And then thirdly, we see that a lot of other research groups are coming up with findings that we need to include in our project because they're highly relevant. This is my last slide, and it will come up later in Pieter's presentation as well. I hope you will think with us what you think of this kind of design, and if you have recommendations or corrections or questions, ideas, anything. And the second important questions, are you familiar with ethical framework for policy making in your country that can inspire us to build a Dutch version at the end of our project? Because we promised a lot, but we have also a lot to think about. Thank you very much for your attention.